for watching yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. And this time I'm going to talk about something that I intended to talk about 2 weeks ago, but I had to postpone multiple streams, which is the issue of privatization of the state and how it relates to infrastructure procurement. So I was already asked by someone I respect when I was advertising this on Twitter by former Secretary of Transportation of Massachusetts, Jim Aloisi, who I know well through Transit Matters. He was asking me, what exactly do I mean by privatization of the state? Because there are different models of public-private partnership. And so this required me to actually think of a definition of what the topic of this video is, which is, for me, privatization of the state means shifting the locus of expertise and innovation in policy and policy-related matters from the public to the private sector. That is to say, it means that there is substitution of innovation in procurement techniques, in engineering techniques, in dealing in labor relations, in overall planning and how it relates to other organs such as electricity and other utilities or housing. It means shifting that locus of expertise or that locus of innovation from the public to the private sector. And now this is highly relevant to the report that I am effectively done writing and is now in editing, which is about the issue of construction costs for public transport in Sweden. So we're doing 5 long reports, plus things that are informed by shorter forays into other places. So the 5 long reports are Boston, which is done, and you can see it, no, not on my chat, but on our website. So this is our group website, transitcosts.com. We have the Boston case up there, and then there are the 4 cases, all of which are currently being written, which are about Istanbul, Italy, Sweden, and New York. The Italian case is effectively done. The Turkish case is actually done. The Swedish and New York cases are almost done. Essentially, it's an editing. And now the issue is, as I've been investigating the situation in Stockholm or in the Nordic countries in general, what I've found is that they're interested in effectively privatizing the state. And I'm going to try to check this. This is the Trafikverket procurement. I think it's called the procurement plan or the procurement strategy. And if I can't find the exact thing, I will planned procurements. This is not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is not Vattenfall, West Lankan, and now we will see that. Yes, this. So this is supposed to be a PDF. Current procurement. No, I know. The procurement strategy is what I'm looking for. So, I don't expect you to remember the link, but you can follow the path that I got to it, and this is the title, the procurement strategy, the Westlink project. And something very interested in what they're doing is something called, let me see if I can find it, it's called Pure Client. Yeah, so it's called, so they have this buzzword, which is Pure Client, which is that what they're saying is that they believe that they should only procure private sector things. So this is what it means to be a pure client. the client, there's a contractor which does design and construction. Uh, and they talk a lot about, and they talk about this is, they say in English, this is an approach in which we move from explaining how things are to be done to what is to be done. This is called functional procurement, in which you just say we need something that does this, and you, the contractor, can decide what to do. And again, you can read this, and you will be able to see the full report very soon. We're talking not days but weeks, and so they talk about raising the productivity of the construction sector. Now, something that they will not tell you is that the construction sector productivity did increase before they did this. They were worrying that the annual growth in the in the productivity of the construction sector in Sweden was only 0.8%, but for example, in the United States, the productivity growth in construction has been negative for decades. So they talk about continuing the adopted course. They like a lot of turnkey contracts in which they talk about fixed price contracts in lieu of itemized contracts. Fixed price contracts have serious problems related to change orders, and you can see that they're saying things like reward innovation and creativity. And they want to have a compatible environment for very large contractors. So they talk about contract size and the importance of doing very large contracts because they want established international contractors. Which is kind of weird because a lot of these contractors come from places that domestically don't do any of this shit. So they don't do pure. So for example, they have a bunch of Italian and Spanish contractors in Sweden, but in Italy and Spain, they're not pure clients. In Sweden, they were not pure clients until very recently. They're still not quite pure clients. What they're doing is they're trying to outsource maintenance, for example. So there's a thing that I will find for you on Railway Gazette. Railway Gazette, Traffic Verket, in-house outsourcing. Yeah. So literally, this just was announced 2 days ago. Traffic Verket is saying that they're going to that they want to outsource their maintenance. They don't want to do rail maintenance by themselves because they think that they should encourage private sector innovation rather than public sector innovation, which again, this is done in-house and then it's on the public sector to do things efficiently. And so they're only taking 3 sections in-house just as a benchmark for which they can study, so that they can oversee private sector innovation. This is an example of privatization, but this is only partial privatization because, for example, under full privatization, you wouldn't even do that. You would be an even purer client. You would just take whatever price that you're given. Now, or maybe you would have some kind of metric for quality, but the quality metric is often one about long-term operating and maintenance cost. And so that is still a cost metric. And now, so here you have Sweden, a country that until 10 years ago had one of the world's lowest construction costs. And again, this is a trend that's pan-Nordic. And they think that they need to do something different. And again, they have had problems with low infrastructure productivity growth. But when they talk about what they're doing, essentially they're never in dialogue with Southern Europe, like Sweden, a place with low construction costs. This is Northern Europe. Remember, people in Northern Europe do not believe Southern Europe has anything to teach us when it comes to high culture engineering. So being subcontractors, yeah, sure. Doing menial labor, yeah, sure, the Turks can do that. Maybe having art from 500 years ago so that people can talk about how there was once Italian greatness and now they're poor, yeah, sure. Food, which is vernacular culture, sure. But the idea that they have good engineering in Italy or in Spain, let alone Turkey, nobody in Northern Europe believes that. So essentially, they're trying to imitate Britain. Britain is a highly, highly privatized state. Uh, the railway privatization there became a blueprint for the rest of Europe, even as in Britain it is not considered a success and it's being reversed to a large extent. There's this traffic verket. There's another traffic verket document that I can find later where they're literally talking about how the best examples of innovation and how to become a pure client in transport or in infrastructure in general are in Britain and the Netherlands, and the places that they do not want to imitate are Germany and Switzerland. Now, I want to since we're on the transit costs project, let's look at some construction costs, and let's maybe not do metros because the north-south line had some uniquely bad geography. Let me see if I can find high-speed rail. Yes, I can. Uh, so let's look at the high-speed rail database and point something out about the Netherlands. So okay, so why am I in view only? I don't know, but so it means that I also can't straighten that. So this is the cost per kilometer in the Netherlands. It's like 12. Like to, and let me see if you can actually. Let me see. Let me just make sure that I'm not accidentally obscuring you with my face. So I'm definitely not doing it right now. So this is cost in millions of PPP dollars per kilometer. And yes, sometimes it's not the same year, but this is 2004. This is, if anything, should count against the Netherlands if we move things to 2020 or 2021. $83.75 million per kilometer. And again, you can quibble with this a little bit because there is some inconsistency here about connecting lines, but it's a second order effect. So the Netherlands, to be imitated, you can see the other numbers here. They're not this high. So these kind of low numbers are French. The really low number you're seeing here is the original line from Paris to Lyon, which was abnormally cheap. I don't think they can do that again at this point, unfortunately. Again, so you could see things that are a little bit worse, like maybe here's some Italian line. The problem is that this Italian line is between Florence and Bologna. If I move my head here, sorry. Florence to Bologna, this is the tunnel proportion, 94%, because Florence to Bologna, so here is Bologna and here is Firenze. This is basically a tunnel. So another way to think about it is that through the Dutch system that they're trying to imitate, the Dutch system has produced on a line that does not need any tunneling. They have a little bit of tunneling there, but this is the terrain in the Netherlands. The name of the Netherlands might suggest that this might not be the most mountainous place ever. And this is not, by the way, and this is, by the way, not even urban tunneling. So in the Netherlands, tunneling is under open farmland. There were NIMBYs that said that this was valuable agricultural land, and so it should be. It was called the Groene Hart, like the green heart, and so it should have tunnels. So the tunneling was gratuitous, and separately there was not a lot of it. And their construction cost was about even with an almost entirely tunneled Italian line between Bologna and Firenze. And now the Dutch Yeah, 1982 to 2010 is the best increase in monetary and absolute. Yeah, this is something completely different. So the privatization of the state in Britain uh, looks like, and I'm emphasizing looks like because I don't know the exact history there. I know I can have circumstantial evidence that this is what happened, but in Britain, remember in the 1960s and 70s, British costs were not abnormally high by continental European standards. Um, in the 1970s, the Jubilee line was built at lower cost per kilometer than contemporary Italian lines, which were beset by the Tangentopoli. By the 1990s and 2000s, the construction costs in Britain were about three, possibly four times as high as in Italy. So in Britain, the issue is the operations are very good, at least. So I won't say the operations are very good, but my best example of good operations in Britain is TfL. TfL is the one island where they don't privatize the state. TfL is much more public sector when, at least when operations and maintenance are concerned. Now, what is true is that no, it is the not no, sorry, it's a different figure of speech. What is the situation in Britain? The really bad stuff is their construction costs, and this is where everyone is trying to imitate them when it comes to stuff like private sector innovation. Remember, it was in the Trafikverket. It was in the Trafikverket document that they were trying to unleash private sector innovation, and this is something that is mirrored in many other uh, reports that they have been putting out in the last 15 years about the importance of unleashing private innovation, the about how they want to. They don't explicitly say we want to be like Britain, but they're portraying Britain as a positive case. And remember, and they're doing it specifically in the context of construction. In construction, um, it's difficult for me to think of a single continental European subway that is as expensive as what is being done in London. I, there's nothing that I know of that is costlier than Crossrail. Um, the Battersea extension is not quite worse than anything in continental Europe, um, but I think that the only things that are worse are either very complex regional rail tunnels, like the second line in Munich. The Battersea extension is not regional rail; it's much simpler than that. Um, I think maybe the north-south line in Amsterdam, which has many of the same issues, but also horrifically complex geology, because it's always harder to build in very soft soil. So this is why I don't want to slack on Dutch construction too much because of the north-south line. This is legitimately very complex, and within China, where the institutions are essentially the same in the entire country, um, their Netherlands is called Shanghai, and is also the cost capital of the country. And it's not because the city is rich, because Beijing is rich, Shenzhen is rich, Guangzhou is rich. But in our cost database, Shanghai produces the costliest subways. It's a matter of soil. It's a matter of alluvial soil conditions making it difficult to tunnel. Um, that's not the only geological thing that would create problems, but it consistently creates problems. Um, so you have that. I think you have I think you have the metro line in Budapest, which was abnormally expensive due to very high levels of corruption that predate Orban to a large extent, but have been maintained and, if anything, worsened um, under Orban. And this is something that the EU is aware of and is one of the things that is on their list of reasons why they're essentially putting Hungary on notice when it comes to EU funding. It's it's not that Orban is anti-Semitic, because um, Austria is full of anti-Semites, and it would be unthinkable to do it to Austria. Um, Poland is also horrifically anti-Semitic. They were considering putting Poland on notice, but Poland, especially now with Putin, they're starting to behave a little bit better. Um, it's a lot. So it's not like the EU Commission cares about the rights of queer people who are being lynched in Hungary and in Poland. They do care about issues of corruption, about issues of fair procurement. They care about a lot about judicial independence. They care about media independence, and uh, they don't think a lot about construction costs. In fact, there's practically no interest in Europe, certainly at the EU level. There's certainly no interest in absolute construction costs. It's much more common to study cost overruns rather than absolute costs. But the corruption that leads to money disappearing that's supposed to be earmarked for cohesion infrastructure, that gets noticed. So these are essentially London's peers when it comes to very high costs. It's alluvial soil and what is arguably Europe's most corrupt country at this point. And so, um, so yes, the UK, you're right, has had a large increase in ridership due to privatization, mirrored in other parts of Europe, but yeah, the UK was better than France and Germany. I don't know if Britain was the best in Europe in general. I think Switzerland has had enormous increases, doing kind of the opposite. And so in Switzerland, they do outsource maintenance. So when I'm talking about privatization of the state, I'm absolutely not talking about contracting things out as an example of privatization. So I've been slagging on Sweden for the last 20 minutes. Here's something that is absolutely privatization that Sweden has been doing. An example of privatization that is often being done in Germany. And in fact, there's a lot of politicking about this in the context of Berlin, which has not done so far, which is contracting out operations to a private company. Or I should say private company, because quite often these are national railways that act as private contractors abroad. For example, RATP will be your private contractor often. RATP is owned by the French state. SNCF under the name Keolis, DB under the name Arriva, NS under the name Abellio. These are very common in Britain. They're alongside actually private ones. So in Britain, this would be, for example, Virgin Trains. Everywhere it could be Transdev / Veolia. That's an actually private company. But the point is that so you have these nowadays you also have maybe startups. You have things like Italo. You have /NTV. You have things like Flixtrain. And that is not quite privatization. I mean, it can be privatization if the planning is privatized, but you have but you can have public planning in which the schedule will be planned publicly. So essentially, all of the innovation is intended to be public. When you run, for example, a clock face timetable in which there's a centrally imposed timetable to make sure that the buses and the trains connect, the trains on different lines connect, to make sure that the fares are integrated. That is an example of public planning, and now it's possible to contract these segments out to private operators. Stockholm has been doing that. So Stockholm County has been recently stepping up this contracting out to the MTR. So the Stockholm Metro is actually MTR. And the commuter trains, as if I'm forgetting when, but very recently, they're also contracted out with the MTR, and this essentially means that the workers work for the MTR. A lot of it is explicitly designed to avoid contentious labor fights, essentially to make sure that management is private, so the people whose job is to tell the workers, no, you don't get a raise, are not as beholden to politics. That is not the same as privatization, by the way. This is, again, it's very different from privatization of planning. If you're just privatizing the um, scourging of the workers to someone else, this is essentially what's happening in Berlin. Like in Berlin, this has not been privatized. Um, the U-Bahn and the buses are run by our city, by our public city agency, BVG, and the S-Bahn is run by Deutsche Bahn. Um, now there is running under contract, and often the choice of do you run your S-Bahn under contract to Deutsche Bahn uh, or to a private railway, which again could be actually private like Transdev, or it could be a foreign uh, national railway like Abellio, aka NS, and that is often a political decision. So Berlin is maybe more left wing, so it so far has not done so, and a lot of and the thing that animates Die Linke activists and the left flanks of SPD and the Greens the most is uh, not doing that on the S-Bahn, but that is not privatization of planning. Again, we can discuss whether it's a good idea, but this is not the topic, because in Stockholm, the frequency is decided by the public sector, by SL. And the fares are integrated. Now, there might be some kind of scheme about at what rate there's payments to the MTR for running service, and the MTR may even be required to assume some risk of low ridership, but that's not the same, because the fares and the schedules are determined publicly. In the same way that I do not consider it to be privatization of the state if, as was happening historically, Trafficverket or Metropolitana di Milano or Metro de Madrid, or maybe historically even LATP to some extent, would come up with its own in-house designs and then bid them out to private contractors, while the designs, even if there's some assistance of consultants, even the designs are at least partly done in-house, the planning is in-house, even if consultants assisted on the designs are owned by the public sector, and the public sector is ultimately responsible to their success or failure. If you then contract out the design to construction firms, that's not privatization. That's contracting out. So when I talk about privatization, I'm specifically talking about the issue of considering the most important thing to do to do private sector innovation with, again, that would be mostly engineering techniques, and the issue is this doesn't work, and I want to explain why this doesn't work. So before I give some kind of mechanistic explanation, I want to point something out, which I reserve the right to not be able to find right now. No, Tunnelbanen, procurement. Be part of extending the Stockholm Metro, and I'm gonna see if they can find. So this is something that exists in English as well, which is why I'm looking at it. It's sustainability, code of construction sites, all ongoing and future procurements. And let's see this. This is exactly the same as before. Okay, open. And I would like to point something out. Because again, I've seen this document, and so wait. Oh, that's an ongoing one. Okay, so where's the past one? Okay, I'm looking for a document which I have seen, which I can link to later. The issue is that I'm seeing the names of the contractors, Awarded contracts. I don't want current procurements. I want the already awarded contracts. And they will tell you who they're contracting with. So you can say China Railways. You might notice from the procurement strategy that I outlined before, I was dumping on it, but they are very good at making sure that the international market can work there. And so there's a lot of competition. So this is to their credit. So you definitely want as a client to make sure you have a lot of different contractors that compete with each other, because if you don't, then you're paying oligopoly prices, is what's happening in the United States. Okay, and these are some companies that you probably have not heard of, like Itinera or whatever, but here's one that you probably have heard of. So here is the building of a tunnel and stations for 900 million kronor. This is around $100 million, and this is given to Skanska. And I want to emphasize what Skanska is, because Skanska is not this hidden gem that only Sweden has heard of. You note that as soon as I put Skanska in Google, I'm already seeing Skanska USA. Skanska built parts of 2nd Avenue subway. It's replacing elevators on the New York City subway. It was, I believe, the sole bidder. So this, I believe, was a one-bid contract on the 7 extension. The renovations, you can see Skanska everywhere in New York. So when people talk about private sector innovation, what they're saying is that the locus of innovation lies in companies like Skanska. To be very clear, Skanska is a highly innovative company. But at the end of the day, let me show you something about our database. So here is New York City, and here's the 7 extension. The 7 extension cost $1.5 billion per kilometer. 2nd Avenue subway was even a little costlier. And at home, this is going to create problems for me. I'm not going to do the new Tunnelbanan contracts because we have not yet updated for the cost overrun. But here's Citybanan, which is a more complex project. You take present-day inflation into account, it's about $300 million a kilometer. And this is a complex regional rail tunnel in which the 2 stations that were built were both underneath existing subway stations. This did not happen for either the 7 extension or 2nd Avenue subway. In fact, Stockholm City, the center of this network right now, is not on level -2, it's on level -3, because there's the red and green lines, and then beneath them the blue line, and only beneath that did they mine this station. So an extremely complex project. This is why when I saw this cost, which is about the same as the global median, I did not think Sweden is even middling. I thought Sweden was very good for being able to build such a complex project for what is a normal global cost. And so it's the same contractor. It's the same engineering firm. Often it's the same engineers. It's not like Sweden is sending the hacks to New York while keeping the real gems at home. They don't do that. Prague, one of their standard contractors is Skanska, and at this point the construction costs in Prague have gone from median to very high. And so the difference by contractor does not seem to be especially relevant, at least not as far as construction is concerned. I've heard things, and I'm not going to say the names of the companies, but I've heard things about the different design consultants. So you have these consultants. So you have these companies that you've probably also heard of if you're that kind of a transport geek. So it's things like so it's companies like Nelson Nygaard or Jacobs or Arup or ACOM. Uh, and uh, and for example, or WSP or Parsons. Wait, is WSP the same as Parsons? Okay, now I'm confused. WSP. No, that would be. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The R Parsons. Okay. Yeah. I did. Yeah. Yeah. They did buy them. So my point is that you have these various companies, and I have heard, and I don't just mean from activists who hate these companies. I have heard um, people, and again, I'm not going to say what they've said because it's not deep enough a base of interviews for me to confidently opine that some of these are better than others. Um, so maybe that's an example of private sector innovation, but it was also told by the same person who told me that it's impossible for the public sector to exactly figure out who's good and who's bad this way because all the companies work on all the projects. So a mega project might have one component of its design done by WSP, another by Arup, and so on, and so it's hard to tell who the weakest link is. Um, but certainly not for the construction contractors. The construction contractors are the same in the most expensive and the cheapest places in the world. So that was a Swedish example of Skanska. But East Side Access, East Side Access is the costliest single item in our database. And so it's and I'm not even sure that the costs are correct just because they keep running over. I think it's been 12 billion at this point. Uh, so it's about $4 billion a kilometer east side access, and the contractor that's doing the mining underneath Grand Central for the oversized terminal that they're building there is Dragados. Dragados is a Spanish firm. So again, we're talking about examples where you have these conglomerates that work on both extremely expensive and extremely cheap projects. And these conglomerates aren't doing the thing where they're making sure to send their worst to America and keep the best at home. That's not how it works. To some extent, there is extraction there. That is to say, Dragados knows that they can get away with charging more in the United States. I've heard this from European firms in the United States. I'm not going to say who, but that's not because but this part is not me being secret. This is me not remembering. So I cannot tell you whether Dragados is one of these or not because I don't remember. But even then, that suggests something. That's not what's important. It's not private sector expertise because that's the same. It's the same Dragados. It's the same Skanska. These other companies, the ones that you're how much are they global and how much are they local? In the United States, they're global. It's not so Dragados entered the United States at least as Dragados. It's not a random American hack that got rebranded as an imprint of Dragados, and I'm about 90% certain this is also true of Skanska. Yes, it's a good question, but it's often the same people working on these and bouncing between. And again, with Dragados, I can tell you for a fact that this is what's happening. And I know this is also true for other firms, at least when it comes to U.S. versus Europe. Again, I don't remember which one, and I'm about 90% certain that Skanska is among them. That Skanska USA does not have that history. Now they could be working with a specific subcontractor who is unusually bad, but that's not the same thing because the whole point of the design build system is that the contractor chooses its own subcontractors. So the contractor can choose its own, but this is in practice not what's happening. What is happening is a matter of public sector expertise. Can the public sector oversee the private sector successfully? In Sweden, the answer so far has been yes. And even as they're trying to anglicize themselves, they're retaining some of that capacity, which is the example that I showed before from Railway Gazette, where the plan for Trafikverket is to is to keep is to do 3 sections by itself, just so that it can know what to expect from the private sector. So they're already thinking of themselves as an informed client, a client that has in-house expertise and maybe wants not to engage too much, which might be a labor issue. It might be a way of preventing wages from rising too far above productivity. That's a big thing all over Northern Europe. The middle class is, and the managers are trying very hard to prevent this from happening. But that is not what you do design build, because in design build, you're outsourcing the design. The build has always been outsourced. When you're outsourcing the design, who are you trying to, what wages are you trying to suppress? The wage of an engineer? If anything, you're paying the engineer more if the engineer expects to bounce between this place and, let's say, the U.S. or Britain. And so it's a matter of retaining some amount of capacity to oversee the contractors, and this is where the innovation is. The difference in construction costs between a place like Italy or Spain or Sweden on the one hand and the United States or even the United Kingdom on the other, it's the same firms, and often it's the same. It's even the same design consultants. WSP has been getting consulting work in Sweden for I don't even know how long. I saw I saw a study by them from, I think, 2005. And it was not a minor study. It was the study that looked at the costs and benefits of, I forget whether Citybanan or Nya Tunnelbanan, aka the Stockholm Metro expansion project, but they but the design doc, the benefit cost analysis, was being outsourced to them already almost 20 years ago. So the the question is, can you oversee the design? Is there enough Is there enough ability of the public sector to be able to call bullshit? For example, if something is proposed that isn't really necessary, or importantly, there's the issue of how to deal with groups. I'm going to call them NIMBYs, but are not exclusively NIMBY. So I heard of this example in Belgium, and I believe it's line 3 in Brussels. It's had some trouble with the construction because they have this problem where they're building through when they're building through a working class neighborhood, and I don't know the geography of Brussels very well. If Diego is here, then I'm actually curious about this, but I don't know the urban geography of Brussels well, so I can't just point out to you where it is on Google Earth. But the point is that they're passing underneath a park in a low-income neighborhood, and they wanted to use that as a staging ground for a station. And the neighborhood complained that it was going to reduce their quality of life, and the neighborhood doesn't have enough parks, and blah blah blah. Now, the correct thing to tell these people is to shut the hell up. This is Europe. If people in that neighborhood were complaining that the cops shoot them too much, or that they're being overly incarcerated, or that it's difficult for a woman who wears a hijab to get a job, then the entirety of Belgium would tell them to fuck right off, and that they suffer from not having proper European values, and they would find the 5 worst anti-Semites in the neighborhood and pretend that they are characteristic of the entire community. If, however, they're complaining about something very hyper local, like a park, suddenly they're being listened to. And And in the United States, it's pretty much the same, except the Americans have learned how to tell black people to fuck off in somewhat more politically correct language, except that essentially what they're saying is the same as what the Europeans are saying to black people, but mostly to Muslims. And so part of the importance of a good public sector is counter NIMBYing. So this means either making sure they don't complain in the first place, either because you bring some people into the loop and maybe do a thing where you're open to them and you listen to their concerns, and then you make sure that they get why it is necessary. And this is at least the examples that have been told, that have been shown as positive examples, are not very lecture at all. It's not outrage. It's something from the North South line in Amsterdam. So again, caveat emptor about how successful it was, given how expensive the North South line was. But the new construction manager was making sure to make himself available to everyone, to go to bars in the area in the evening and like tell people what he was doing and if they had any questions, and making sure and saying from the start that the state would pay for any private damage that the tunneling was doing to people's homes. So that is, for example, a good example. That is, for example, good counter NIMBYing. Or stuff like removal of surface area, aka you make sure that individuals can be in the loop, but the organic community can't be, because the organic community is always going to be an unusually reactionary group, because, for example, they're going to be dominated by people whose values are internal to the community, so the people who don't want to get out. Often it's people who don't travel to the rest of the city, so they don't care about the subway, they just care about extracting surplus from the state. It's kind of the least integrated people. And I know that integration is often a term used for immigration, and that is relevant for that project in Brussels. It isn't in Amsterdam. In Amsterdam, it was not like this at all. It is not like this in, for example, Stockholm either. Stockholm is full of immigrants, but Nye Tunnelbanen is built through partly through rather wealthy areas like Södermalm, or it's being built to speculative. I shouldn't say speculative. They're actually doing TOD there to do future TOD sites rather than through existing working class neighborhoods which already have subways. But when I say integration, anyway, I don't just mean the euphemism for assimilation. I mean the part where even in a neighborhood that is demographically average, so that would be in Germany 10% people of color, and a place like Sweden would be 20%. It would be a place where even then, when talk about integration, I mean that the sort of people who tend to be neighborhood notables are unusually local in their outlook. So to them, major state priorities about infrastructure, they don't mean anything to them, because they only care about the neighborhood. Because if they were the sort of person who travels from the neighborhood to city center, they would not socialize within the neighborhood. They would be socializing citywide, and that weakens their political clout within the neighborhood. So when I talk about the need to disempower neighborhoods, I mean disempower the organic neighborhood, disempower the concept where you have the neighborhood vote on its own leaders, because these are not going to be people who are typical for the neighborhood. They're going to be people who are atypically hyper local. It's often a small business owner, someone who very often drives, even in a city that is majority non-driver. This is a very big problem of local empowerment in New York City. New York City is majority car-free. The majority of New York City households do not own a car. Even among households that do own a car, it's much more common to own just one car rather than two. And so in a place with 250 cars per 1,000 people, neighborhood advocacy is dominated by drivers, and not just in the outer areas that are maybe a little more car oriented. It's even, you will see people complain about this in Washington Heights or in central Harlem. Or in parts of Queens that are very much on the subway and are still very much majority non-driver, and so there's and so it's important to set up a public system where you have maybe a civil service that the politicians will take when there's conflict between the civil service and between a neighborhood notable. Both sides know that if it that if heavyweight politicians are called in, they will take the side of the civil service. This is something very important. This is entirely a public sector intervention to make sure that the civil service is empowered to say no to a neighborhood, and a neighborhood is not empowered to make unreasonable demands for signature stations, for example, or for maintaining certain roads, or making sure that certain roads stay open without disruption, or making sure that or making sure that the park stays open without disruption. All of these things can be incredibly expensive, and the neighborhood never has to pay. So you want to keep a lid on the other people's money problem, which is endemic to the United States. It is also pretty bad in Britain, I believe. So this is something that you need to keep a lid on, and this is entirely a public sector, an example of public sector innovation. The ability to build without saying yes to every without saying yes to every store owner who believes that they have a veto power. Another thing is dealing with utilities. This is not something that I've ever heard of as a problem in Europe, except in the Netherlands. But in the United States, they have toxic relationships between different parts of the government, and these cascade down to their contractors. A contractor for the New York City subway will not will not be treated well by, for example, Con Ed, and so it gets to the point that multiple times by people from multiple different transit agencies in the United States, I was asking about the issue of bus shelter. It's very cheap intervention. I was told in Providence it costs $10,000 to $15,000 to install shelter at a RIPTA station. I think it was an urban cost. It's actually harder to do it in the suburbs, often because there's no sidewalk, and then they might need to redo the entire sidewalk. But in a city, I was told 10 to 15K. And then I've seen numbers that go up to 30K or even more. And so, for example, I was asking, wait, why is it so expensive? Why are you talking about 30 or even 50? And one of the things that they said is that some of these agencies, they said that they need solar panels and batteries for electronic signs saying when the next bus comes, because they don't know where the power cable is, and the power company doesn't care enough to tell them. And as soon as they need to interface with the power company, things get so hairy that they would rather install gratuitous solar power. Now, solar power can be very efficient, but at utility scale. This is smaller than household scale. And so to power these next bus signs, suddenly they're spending tens of thousands of dollars because of their inability to interface well with a power company. And so resolving these relationships is an example of a public sector innovation. And this is not something you can do by privatizing both sides. If you privatize both sides, you will still extract surplus from each other. I mean, in the history of private railways, for example, this is practically legendary. There was something called Frog Wars when where railways would would be fighting over crossings. In California, competing railways had gangs of hired gunmen for shooting at each other's crews sometimes. So this is not something that you can resolve through privatizing everything. On the contrary, it's something that you resolve through having the public sector take everything under its umbrella and make sure that they talk to each other, and make sure that they don't snipe. This is um, this is something that's incredibly important, and again, that's purely a public sector innovation. It's something where the Italian public sector, where they have an excellent survey of underground utilities, uh, and on top of that, it's very easy to get around them, and if they yeah, no, yeah, and the fact that everything is outsourced to JC Decaux is a thing, but that's because New York City convinced themselves. For example, I know this about New York. I don't know this about elsewhere, but in New York, it was told explicitly that they're not even thinking about spending public money on this. They're just outsourcing the entire planning, including the timeline, to I don't remember if JC Decaux or to another advertising company that's expecting to pay this out of ads. And meanwhile, uh, the majority of bus stops in New York City uh, have no shelter. Um, and this is something where a course that's citywide, uh, if you're bad at it, it is going to be mid three-figure millions or mid nine figures, whatever you want to call it. And if they're good at it, and if they also realize they need to kill half the bus stops anyway, that's high double-digit millions or high eight figures. Um, and so if they do that, that's going to lead to meaningful, to visible increases in ridership. Barnes, I'm talking about privatization or deprofessionalization. I'm talking about privatization, but it's different from the Japanese style in which J and R. So I could, if you want, talk about the Japanese privatization system later, but it's very different from the European one. And I actually don't know whether it parallels how construction is being done in Japan. I just don't know. All I know is that in Seoul, Line 9, which was highly privatized, was the construction of it was not so privatized. So it is given to the private sector to run, and the outcomes are not great. So about TFL, I'll talk to you. I want to talk about this, about the history of municipalization or nationalization later, but I just want to point out that you have, so with the issue of the bus shelter, really it's a matter of, can you actually make sure that the electric utility and the transit agency talk to each other? And this is not something that privatization will ever fix. And so so anyway, this is something that's being left on the table. And again, and maybe it's not something that Swedes think about very much because it hasn't cropped up there. But in the United States, it's huge. And the thing is, Europeans don't think much about the United States. Europeans usually look down on the United States, but it's like looking down from afar. It's not. I mean, maybe Europeans have heard about the guns or the lack of universal health care, but it's very uncommon to know the details. Whereas they do know the details of the rest of Europe. Often they like, often they don't like. So they look down on Italy, for example, in Northern Europe, but they look down on. But my understanding is that they look down on Italy much more closely. So they keep talking about the evils of whatever Southern Europe is doing, or they come up with a social problem and they pretend that Italy has it. But people will, for example, know more, I think, about the history of corruption in Italy than they will about the history of the politicization of the civil service in the United States. So, for example, it's uncommon knowledge in Europe how the United States never had the strong civil service that we have. Britain did. Britain had a strong civil service, and then Maggie decided she doesn't like it. But the United States never did that. Reagan did politicize this, but he was politicizing things that were already politicized. In the 1950s already, I believe there were more than 1,000 federal direct political appointees. Today there are 4,000, but the idea that you would have a government with 1,000 political appointees is unthinkable here. I'm pretty sure it's also unthinkable in Britain. So, so this is so this is not exactly a matter of privatization. Not in the United States. In Britain, yes, but in the United States, they just never developed the necessary public sector expertise to increase the construction sector productivity. How to increase that productivity? Through avoiding surplus extraction at the local level, through avoiding labor surplus extraction. So I keep talking about how they're using privatization here as a strategy to prevent wages from growing in excess of productivity. In the United States, this was not done. And so in the United States, there is this problem of a labor aristocracy and a labor gerontocracy. These are two separate problems, but they interact. And the issue is that, and the bottom line is that they pay bus drivers and they pay train drivers in the United States far in excess of what people pay them here. Yeah, I don't know if they're elected at this later. A lot of this comes from a seniority system, which is why I call it a labor gerontocracy, where you assign yourself to jobs based on a seniority order. And the Sad Honks Union is also extremely closed to the public because they know that they're earning a large multiple of what they're worth. And again, it's not all the unions. The bus drivers aren't like this at all. The bus drivers, they clear. If anything, they get paid below market rate in the United States, and it's still much higher than what they get paid here, essentially because the experience for a junior worker is miserable because of the gerontocracy problem. So a recent hire will get the worst possible shifts. Often the scraps from what's left by the rest. They can't even do, like in, for example, France, they have a labor gerontocracy. I don't think it's as bad as the United States at the public sector. Economy-wide, yes. But my understanding is that economy-wide, it's worse in the United States private sector, better than the public sector. What they do in France with the gerontocracy issue is that your job description will say where you report to and what shifts you take. So the most desirable jobs are day shifts. So if you start with a night shift, and then after a couple years, you will move to a day shift. So you have that, but it's a consistent night shift. In the United States, in New York, if you're low seniority, you might be reporting to a yard to a bus depot in East New York one day, and then to one near Coney Island the next day. You can't even live in it. You can't even arrange yourself to live near a bus depot or on a good bus or subway line to the bus depot. So, for example, you have to get a car. Now, most of the working class in New York City does not own a car. Remember, most of New York City is car-free. And that's at household level, not just individual level. So I'm not just counting, let's say, a non-working parent. No, most households in New York are car-free. In addition, the probability of owning a car increases with income. And bus drivers and subway drivers in New York, they earn okay money, but they don't earn... I think they earn a little bit above the average in the city. They're not wealthy. I mean, a lot of the car ownership in New York is people who are very far out, like cops, especially, have very anti-city self-conception in, like, really anywhere in the United States, but it's specific, very outer neighborhoods, which are not where the transit workers live, because why would you be a transit worker and live in Staten Island? The bus depots are not in Staten Island, or let alone the subway depots, or very rich people to some extent. And again, these are not very rich people. Their bosses are. I mean, say very rich, I mean $300,000 here. I don't mean millions, but so these are people who do not need to be owning a car. normally, but they do own cars, and the reason they own cars is that the shift system kind of forces them to. So it's just poor work conditions, and these are examples of poor public sector behavior. Now, this is something that privatization could change just because the private sector does not work based on a labor gerontocracy, not in the United States. But that's still a public sector problem, not a private sector problem. It's not an issue of increasing the innovation of the private sector. It's a matter of increasing the innovation of the public sector. And again, this specifically is something where, owing specifically to the issue of the American labor aristocracy and the labor gerontocracy in the public sector, could be fixed. But this is not the same as, for example, being able to have some kind of industrial peace, or rather a combo of industrial peace and innovation. This is something that Northern Europe is rather good at. France, for example, isn't. The United States certainly isn't. But all of this is a matter of how the public sector conducts labor management relations. Then there's the utilities issue when it comes to construction, and there's the ability to oversee contractors, the ability to give contractors what they need when they have little needs, like making little changes. This requires public sector oversight when there's variation from the design. And you can just ignore all of that into a design build, but often the design build still involves a hefty extent of political micromanagement. So avoiding the political micromanagement is also a very important example of public sector innovation. So when you have public sector innovation, things that the public sector does well, or rather things that are naturally in the public sector, they could be done well or poorly, are done well. And that is essentially the problem with this privatization of planning, with this privatization of design, is that it assumes that the problem with construction sector productivity lies in issues of engineering techniques that are maybe things that a private contractor could come up with, where by far the biggest difference in construction costs is based on institutional and public factors. There's a reason why, if I know the construction costs of a subway in one city, they predict very accurately the construction costs of another subway in the same city or even in the same country, to the point that variations are notable. There's a reason why this persists even through macro clusters of countries. In this case, it would be that Sweden, Norway, and Finland all look very similar when it comes to construction costs. Denmark is a bit more expensive than them. It's also, now these are maybe not clusters that are fully predictable in advance, because there's no Europe versus Asia difference. But once you see them, they're there. And you can even make guesses about others. So, for example, based on Canada and the US and the UK and Singapore, I saw that there's this kind of Anglosphere cluster, and then I started seeing Australia and New Zealand, and then Hong Kong, all of which have very expensive subways. Moreover, in the peripheral Anglosphere, one of the things they keep drilling is that the construction cost crisis has been, so there's the American one, but this is not something where the United States has as much soft power, except maybe in Canada. This is something that really begins in Britain. Again, I want to say it begins with Thatcher, but it's something that is more accurate to say is roughly coincident with Thatcher, because I do not know for certain that this is causal, but it's something that begins in Britain, again, roughly at the same time as Maggie, and is then exported, and we see the kind of adoption of these ideas, and lead to large cost increases in Canada, Singapore, Hong Kong, and more recently, I believe also Australia and New Zealand. New Zealand's a little harder because they're about to build their first urban rail tunnel, but you can compare it to previous projects that they've built. And so and so this is a matter of public sector of differences in the quality of the public sector and not in the quality of the private sector that can just be done through selecting a better contractor. Selecting good contractors is important. Having many contractors to make sure that they don't monopoly price the hell out of you is also important. But again, but even making sure there's a lot of competition, that is not private but public sector innovation. When people talk about private sector innovation, they don't talk about competition very much. Quite to the contrary. The sort of people who believe that Elon Musk is like such a genius that the world is divided, that like the world is periodized as before Tesla and after Tesla. These people are not talking about competition between different electric car makers. They just think about Tesla. Um, and even when you have competing companies with their own innovation, let's call them Microsoft and Apple, people don't think about creating lots and lots of competition in operating systems. No, you have Windows and you have Mac, and I'm aware of the 7 zillion distros of Linux. I see both of you Linux users, and even see the one person in the world who still uses Plan 9. You guys know what I mean. So again, and now there is a kind of meta thing where you can have public sector innovation through outsourcing certain things. It's common with labor, but that's something very narrow and very different from what's been happening in the Anglosphere and is again being exported. Yeah, I'm aware. I mean, my computer dual boots Ubuntu and Windows. It's just that for years the Ubuntu has not worked, and because I am not actually a programmer, I do not know how to fix it, and therefore and therefore I can only run Windows. I used to run Ubuntu, again, like just a fun fact on this computer. This is maybe my computer's so old story. 3 years ago, I was in Germany shortly before I moved here. I was visiting a friend, an American friend in Kaiserslautern. And somehow our hotel, the way it worked is it had Wi-Fi, but for some reason my computer could not connect to it on Windows, only on Linux. My phone could connect, my computer could connect on Ubuntu, and so I used Ubuntu a lot then, but since then somehow Ubuntu has stopped working. Again, it's fixable, but it requires someone who knows Linux programming, whereas Apple and Microsoft make products that you do not need to know how to code to use. So borders. You were asking before about Japan. So in Japan, and I promise, I have things to say about Japanese railway privatization. The first thing is it's completely different from the European model. Because in Japan, railways are railways. JR East builds its own stuff. I think except Shinkansen, which are built publicly and then leased to the private operators, but things like the Tohoku Jukan line, like Tokyo Ueno, that was a JR East project. And they run their own trains. If they're JR Central, that's all they do, because JR Central is sitting on a pile of gold and diamonds thanks to the windfall profits from the Tokaido Shinkansen. If you're the others, you also develop real estate near your stations in order to extract some profits from your own trains, and maybe also create TOD so that more people will use their trains. It's very synergistic this way in Japan. There are private railways that essentially do just what I said, but at more metropolitan or in more urban scale rather than intercity, and that's how Japan works. The privatization is that they never nationalized these private commuter railways, and also that they broke up JNR into JR East, JR West, JR Central, JR Hokkaido, JR Shikoku, and JR Kyushu, plus also JR Freight, which has approximately half a train. And so it's very different. It's still in-house there, and yeah, they can get their own contractors, but they've retained the planning capacity. Now, they have substituted private planning in Japan for public planning. They keep talking about how they're going to privatize Tokyo Metro. Um, but um, but again, but that's different context. Um, Specifically, Japan never did fair integration, and this is a problem. It's just something that you can get away with if you're with not doing if you're Tokyo or Osaka. And now, then there's the privatization of JNR, where the important thing is not that they privatize it. It's not which happened decades after JNR ceased to exist. It's not so what people think of as the privatization date, 1989, is not the privatization date. It's the breakup date. JR East, Central, and West remained state-owned until, I'm forgetting, but I want to say 2004 maybe is when they were fully sold off to investors. But they were run as if they were a business. They were run as as SOEs. At the beginning, they were owned by the Japanese state and then sold off to investors. But the important part is now what happened, not in 1989, 1987, right? Okay, now I can see all the variants. Not Wikipedia. Did I just nerd snipe myself into getting the year wrong? No, 1987. Sorry. So the breakup date is 1987, but the important stuff happened not in 87, but between 1980 and 87, and that is when they and that is when they shed about 2/3 of their workforce, and this was a matter of of having good system for industrial peace, while also growing. Again, it's not something that the United States is really capable of, or France. France has the most obstructionist organized working class anywhere that I know of, just as Germany has the most obstructionist middle class that I'm aware of, the most NIMBY middle class that I'm aware of. And so in Japan, even though it has a French-style tradition of labor militancy, and one of the unions at JNR was openly communist, they managed to come up with a deal about how to shed 2/3 of the workforce, which involved private sector placement. Essentially, so I'm going to say this even though I'm pretty sure I've said this before on stream, and it's commonplace it's common Western knowledge about Japan. Japanese and also Korean business culture is that you work for the same employer, for the same big business employer your entire life. So if you're middle class, you go to college. It's in Japan, it's 4 years. I'm forgetting what it is in Korea. I think also 4 years, and then you graduate. You immediately start working for, let's call it, Sony, and then you work probably 43 years at Sony because you retired at age 65. 22 to 65. That's your life. Same employer. The employer you're expected to have to have an identity based on your specific employer, not even the industry. Now, there is in the United States, and for example, the tech industry, an identification as a Googler, but Google is unique, and even at Google, people do bounce between firms. So in the United States, the tech industry is such that people identify with the industry. So people have a strong self ID as a programmer, or even as like a specific kind of programmer who, let's say, works for a tech firm rather than working as a programmer for as a programmer as like staff for a firm producing something else. No, it was not like that in the United States. In the United States, you could move between firms. Like I mean, yes, you could stay at the same company your entire life, especially if especially it was in the context of unions. But the salaryman bounced. Like Mad Men shows us an incredibly fluid advertising business in which someone like Peggy unusually gets promoted to become a copywriter at Sterling Cooper, and she retains her Yeah, IBM is completely disconnected from that culture, like Microsoft slash Google, that culture. But anyway, so on Mad Men, which is very realistic about this. So Peggy starts as a secretary. She's unusually creative, so she's somehow becomes a copywriter. Um, and Don Draper clearly feels that she owes him. He's done favors for her before. And it's not sexual. Like there are people. I mean, Don Draper, sexist asshole. Absolutely. Thinks of women as sexual objects. Absolutely. Um, Breaks off a relationship with a woman who is actually smart and at his level to marry his secretary. Absolutely. Peggy is not to him a sexual object, but he still feels like she owes him. And then she leaves the firm for a much higher paying job at a competitor. Um, and he's pissed. But in Japan, I doubt the competitor would even hire her, and certainly nobody else would hire her afterward because she left. Whereas on Mad Men, we're seeing her. Um, on Mad Men, we are seeing her integrate into the firm, back into the firm. The competitor, like Sterling Cooper and this competitor, merge, and there's no animosity toward Peggy for having left. So in the United States, there was never this culture that you must work for the same employer the entire time. Yeah, it was encouraged, but there's a difference between let's say between how in Japan you're damaged goods if you quit, um, and that. So what they did in the 1980s, 80s, is that they took hundreds of thousands of workers and they made sure to place them doing similar things in the private sector. Um, yeah, a lot of the smaller operators, but again, I'm talking about the 1980s. Uh, in the 1980s, it was a lot more rigid than it is today. You work 6 days a week, um, and so uh, the working hours were a lot longer than in the United States. I believe that like Japan only equalized working hours with the United States. I want to say 90s or early 2000s. And that's when people started saying, "Ha, the United States now has the longest working hours in the first world." That's the Protestant work ethic. In the 1980s, nobody could say that because they knew that Japan existed. Um, and so, and by the way, Greece has longer working hours than both, but nobody really counts Greece about this, not like Japan. But anyway, so they did placement. Now, placement is something you can do if you avoid having a labor aristocracy. In the United States, it's basically impossible to do placement for redundant workers in the public sector because they will never get a job that pays the same thing in the private sector. Um, the Especially in commuter rail. In commuter rail, so think about this: a subway driver in New York City earns about $85,000 a year. Um, Subway, not commuter rail. I forget how much they pay in Switzerland. I want to say they pay about 70,000 in Zurich on the S-Bahn, and that is possibly the highest I know of. Munich might be paying about that as well on the S-Bahn, a little bit less on the U-Bahn. Um, and Switzerland is wealthy. Munich is wealthy. New York pays even more than that. Um, and the commuter rail drivers in New York earn 110 or 120,000 a year. No private sector firm needs someone with that history at that wage. Okay. Um, Maybe you want to become a teacher in New York City. Starting pay for a teacher, I believe, is $67,000 a year with a master's. Um, Industrial, like an industrial worker, if they're unionized, I don't even think they get that. Um, it's something very specific to a public sector. I want to say I talk about public sector labor aristocracy, but I mean I just give you an example of a public sector job that doesn't pay very well, which is teachers. Um, but it's public sector. It's usually public sector jobs that are working class. Um, and now what counts as working class differs. I'm gonna use French definitions of working class, or maybe continental definitions, in which teachers are not the working class. Teachers are intermediate professions. In Britain, a teacher will say that they're working class. In the United States, someone who earns minimum wage will say that they're working. Will say that they're middle class. What I mean is someone who's so what I mean is a blue collar job. Like basically, these people earn far in excess of any other blue collar job. Again, because historically there was no attention paid to preventing wages from rising too far in excess of productivity. Again, in Japan, I mean, all of these wages suck by American standards or even by Northern European standards. So they could find jobs that were doing something different, but at comparable wage. That is again a public sector expertise. I mean, like, so it's a way of producing industrial peace, without taking too much of a hit to productivity. And this is the important thing about Japanese privatization. The success was something that was done before, or rather in the lead up to the chopping up of J&R into 6 pieces. It was letting go of 2/3 of the workforce through placement, and then doing additional attrition, and so that is the real success. It was a fundamentally public sector achievement, that Japan took a wildly unprofitable J&R and made it into one of not many, made it not one to, I want to say 6, but also only the mainland ones earn money. The other 3 lose money. And created, I shouldn't even say 3 because I don't know whether JR Central earns money if you take away the Shinkansen, the Tokaido Shinkansen. Like again, it's sitting on a mountain of diamonds and gold. And so creating, I guess, 2 of, I don't even know if there are any other places in the world outside Tokyo and Osaka where commuter rail consistently makes money. And JR East and JR West do that. They're more labor efficient than European railways. JR Kyushu also makes money? Because I know that JR Hokkaido and JR Shikoku don't. JR Kyushu, that would be a recent thing, right? Because I know that last time I checked, which would have been 2000s, JR Kyushu was still a money-losing SOE. Borders, do you know if it's just 2014? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. By the way, Borders, do you know if JR Kyushu is profitable without Shinkansen? Because I know this is true of JR West and JR East. I do not know if this is true of JR Central. I can see it go either way. Because, for example, S-Bahns here don't make money. Metros do. The Berlin U-Bahn, I believe the Berlin and Munich U-Bahns break even. Knowing that and knowing their efficiencies, I can tell you that the metro in Paris is pretty profitable. All of the money cross-subsidizes connecting buses and suburban trains. Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, right. Because for JR East and West, everything makes money. I mean, I want to say that it's actually hard to lose money when you're running commuter trains between central Tokyo and, let's say, Chiba, but JNR was losing money running commuter trains between central Tokyo and Chiba for 23 years. Fukuoka is profitable. Okay, so so it's just the rural stuff. Okay, yeah, there's a lot of problems with trying to figure out what's profitable and what's not. A lot of the privatization is so in the same way that you can privatize as a way of depoliticizing the question of who tells the workers they're not getting raises. You can also depoliticize the question of who's telling an outlying rural area that they do not get rail service because the train has 18 riders a day. Because, for example, this is something that France was considering doing in the Spinetta Acts, and this led to so much uproar that they did not do it. In Britain, they did do it with the Beijing Acts, but and there's Nishitatsu. And I'm forgetting what's the. I know that Nagoya has profitable private railroads. I do not remember their names. Is it Meitatsu? Wait, I guess there isn't Kintetsu. I mean, Kintetsu is Osaka, but Kintetsu has a line to has a line between Osaka and Nagoya, um, which I imagine is mostly a commuter line in Nagoya because I doubt do people take uh, do people take Kintetsu between Nagoya and Osaka to not pay Shinkansen fares? Um, but anyway, um, so one of the things that privatization did in Japan was to depoliticize the question of who subsidizes a train between one prefecture with 18 residents and another with 25 residents, both of which have a median age of 90. Um, in Japan, it's called third sector railways. Third sector railways, it's a euphemism for things that are subsidized by the prefecture so that people would still have a train. Um, some people have this kind of cope that these are important for the national network. No, they're not. Um, but again, but this is a thing to worry about because sometimes the cross subsidies are to things that are important to the network. So, for example, if you try to just privatize metropolitan public transport, then you're going to not have service, for example, in outlying suburbs. And it's also and often private operators will also under provide circumferential service. They will only provide radial service, whereas circumferential service is very important to the network. And suburban lines feed urban lines in a metropolitan area. And so so when you do it, let's call it the British way, not the London way, the British way, because in London, TfL exists. In the rest of Britain, and this is something for which I absolutely will blame Maggie. Um, so I'm gonna. So I would like everyone to remember that we're currently talking about the problems of bus privatization in uh, secondary British cities. Uh, and pause for a moment because I want to talk about the political reasons. Um, so London at this point is a very labor area, but in the 1980s, I think it voted more labor. I think it voted redder than the rest of Britain, but it wasn't by a very large margin. I mean, even like decades later, Boris became mayor of London. Huh. Okay. Um, like was Paris was before the realignment of French politics as moderates versus extremists, when it was Norby left, Norby right, Paris did vote to the left of the rest of France, but only by a few points. Um, so the capital in these places, and I think this is, and I believe this is also true of Tokyo. Um, I think Seoul voted. I think Seoul might have actually voted for the winner of every recent presidential election in Korea. Um, so, so often the primate city will maybe be a little bit to the left, at least historically. Hell, Stockholm votes center right more than center left. The extreme right is what's weak there. Um, but, and this is an important part, the secondary cities are often left-wing strongholds. Now in Korea it's weird because in Korea it's a matter of do you live in Jeolla or Gyeongsang? Jeolla very left-wing, Gyeongsang the exact opposite. But putting Korea aside, my understanding is that in Japan the power base of the LDP is rural and the power base of the DPJ is secondary cities, and I do not know whether Osaka counts as a secondary city. I believe it's like the Sendais, the Niigatas, the like cities cities at that scale, but cities. Um, and in Stockholm, I'm not sure about Malmö, but Göteborg, Gothenburg, has been run by the Social Democrats for decades. Um, in Berlin, the cities have always been left wing. Well, we don't have a primate city. Not in Berlin. I meant in Germany. Cities are pretty consistently left wing. Oh, no! Oh, it's Nagoya and Tokyo because I thought it was the secondary cities. Huh. Well, I thought Tokyo voted for the winner. Like, I thought Tokyo votes LDP because the LDP wins every election, but then it keeps voting, but it votes maybe a bit more DPJ. I didn't realize it was a stalker stronghold. Um, yeah, no, Vienna, yeah. Oh, small cities are swing. Oh, so that's more American. Okay. In Vienna, yeah, Vienna is, yes. Um, Also, I'm pretty sure pre-war, right? Like, okay, in the democratic history of Austria, has Vienna ever voted for a non-left-wing mayor? Because I'm pretty sure that it was Red Vienna from when it became a democracy at the end of World War One until the coup in the 1930s. Um, um, okay. Um, anyway, so my point is that so in France it depends on the city. Nice very right wing. Lyon I forget. Bordeaux is weird because the region is very left wing. The city is center center right middle class snobs who look down on working class suburbs. Um, but in Britain, at any rate, in Britain, the power base of labor was pretty consistently urban areas that are not London. Um, so it was often interpreted as the North, but it was not. I have no idea why Marseille is rather right wing. Marseille is very right wing. I don't think it's the PN. I don't know if it's the PNY, at least in the way that, at least as I understand it, in the Riviera, the right wing, because they have a lot of uh, Arab immigrants. So all the white people think that the Arab immigrants are going to murder, rape, or both them. I don't think you can say to both them. Murder them, rape them, or both. And so a lot of it is um, anti-Arab racism, uh, even among people who are sufficiently middle class not to be piednoir. Um, anyway, so in Britain, you want to see what the left is. I mean, at this point, it's increasingly London, but historically, it was the northern cities. Now, cities don't have to mean big cities. They don't just mean Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool and Birmingham, which I don't think ever voted for the Tories since the formation of the closest thing to democratic British politics. It was also industrial cities, the Newcastles and such. Um, and so this is where, and the North was very industrialized. And where did the Tories? What was the power base of the Tories? Things that were not cities. Essentially, the parts of the south, like the home county like the suburbs of London, in the home counties, places in the south that were never very industrial. So maybe Labour would win a seat in like Southampton uh, or eventually Oxford and Cambridge, and then everything around them uh, would be very Tory. I bring this up because in Britain, the question of how to how to regionalize governance on politics, has been like on everyone's mind for multiple generations. Um, and and so there were various reform ideas that created something called the Met counties. One of them, the metropolitan counties, which are really cool things that metropolitan county or counties. Right, in Britain they like little letters, not big letters. So these are the Met counties. Okay, you have one for Newcastle, Leeds, Sheffield, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham. Uh, and the idea is that these are supposed to be metropolitan governance for the secondary cities of England. And as you can see, abolition of the county councils. The problem is that Maggie hated labor, and so she abolished them. So at this point, these exist as places on a map, but they are rare examples of single-tier governance, where the single tier is the city, not the entire county. Kind of dividing them so that they don't have enough power to create a high-profile politician who represents the entirety of the West Midlands or of West Yorkshire or whatever, who can say the Tories are bad for Britain. And so one of the things that happened is that the buses should be planned regionally, which means creating strong Met County organs. It's something that the Tories understand at this point is necessary, and they keep saying that they're going to do it. I don't know if it's not happening because they're lying or because it's just taking very long, but it's on the agenda. Now, he asked me, they should also at the same time go single tier and abolish all of the smaller levels of government, so this becomes Birmingham and nobody has to care if it was historically in Birmingham or Coventry. But that's just me, I think. But you still still need to have these strong regional bodies and give them the ability to plan the buses, because right now the buses are entirely private. So this means that the bus companies choose their own fares, choose their own schedules. They don't connect with the others, and yeah, I mean, you can have public planning of, let's say, a light rail line, but these light rail lines are incredibly compromised, partly because of high British costs, partly because of things that lead to high British costs. They also lead to compromised lines, and so so there just isn't a lot of regional planning. And this is something that, again, they could privatize this. They could absolutely have a West Midland-wide bus and rail network in which the West Midland regional government decides how much service it wants to run, and then contracts out to bus companies. Okay, you're going to run this bus that is going to have a knot for connecting in, let's say, Coventry or in Warwick or wherever, and something similar in Merseyside, aka Liverpool, or Greater Manchester. They don't have a name other than Greater Manchester, which is already substantially the case for TfL. TfL didn't used to run commuter rail. I think either they're about to start running commuter rail or they just got the authority to run commuter rail. And even then, my understanding is that it's being contracted out, but it's being contracted out with public planning, and that's the important part. And that can be done even with, for example, the public sector dealing with the labor issue, which is, I think, even under privatization. They had a strike, I'm forgetting when, I want to say 2018, with Crossrail, but they're about to do this also with the other commuter line, as I understand it. And again, you do have this labor issue, but TfL has managed to go driver only on the tube. Scotland devolution is always fun, and also even under privatization. Again, I think it was 2018. I believe it was Southern that had big strikes. I believe it was because the management wanted to go driver only on the trains, and so they had strikes, and I saw the canceled service at St. Pancras, and I know that St. Pancras points north and not south, but because of Thameslink, it also points south, so I imagine this would be the train through Brighton. And so even though there was a privatized service with Southern, it still involved the government taking a position. This was the Tories. I think it went back to Cameron even before Brexit, saying to management that he's going to side with them if there's going to be a strike over, again, I believe it was driver-only trains. So even in a highly privatized environment, in practice, you still need some amount of public sector competence in the ability to, in this case, manage staffing levels, manage labor relations. Um, now, Borners, you told me a while ago, here, almost an hour ago, the expertise was private until 1934, and that is correct. 1934 is not 2022. 2022 is not the same as 1934, and there are a bunch of really important differences since then. The first is the nature of travel. So this is not a construction cost issue. This is a network planning issue. But the way people traveled in the late 19th, early 20th century was they would travel to city center or they would stay within the neighborhood. And often staying within the neighborhood was a lot more common than it is today. There were people in turn of the century Brooklyn who never visited Manhattan. They went to downtown Brooklyn or they stayed in the neighborhood. And in that kind of environment, people walk within the neighborhood. There are no cars yet, so you don't. So that's not meaningful competition. And then you could just build radial rail lines, and you have very light public supervision. In Britain, this would have been Parliament telling various railways that were proposing lines along very similar alignments to merge and build one together, or to have a little bit of coordination. This was something that was done in 19th century Britain, but in practice, it was private planning. But again, this was a matter where you just needed to go to city center. And rising complexity of urban geography over the 20th century meant that you need more than that. You also need connections that are out of the neighborhood and are not to city center, but are to secondary nodes. And often it involves figuring out where the secondary nodes are going to be based on the state of the network. It means modern TOD. Now, the idea that you build housing near the railway, that's partly TOD, but it's not all of TOD. So yes, metro land existed, and what made Elizabeth Trump rich was building TOD near what was then the Corona line, then the Flushing line, and is now the 7 train. And then selling it at a profit after the subway was there. So that was early TOD, but it's different because it's TOD on empty land, and that's less complex to deal with than brownfields. And a lot of modern TOD is brownfields rather than greenfields. Now you do have greenfield, like for example in Stockholm, near Tunnelbanan is partly to greenfield construction sites, but if you're but that's extensions of existing lines. It's not something you can do purely private planning because the lines pre-exist. So even that requires public planning today. If you're extending a line, and if it's a new line, it's probably a new line you're going to build within more central parts of the city. So that involves brownfields, and that involves necessary public coordination. There's also more utilities right now to deal with. And so all of these things just require far more coordination than before, which is where we're seeing various places constantly look at international expertise. People in Sweden know that they didn't use very much international contracting expertise in the 1950s. They also know that it's not the 1950s anymore, that you need more, that part of economic growth is scale. So these small, plucky, national scale contractors, for example, they don't have the scale. This is where we're starting to see mergers within the construction industry. And if you're seeing mergers, then you might lose sufficient competition, and that requires either bringing this entire industry in-house, or parts of it in-house at least, or parallel imports. And parallel imports are a matter of state capacity again, because it requires some kind of state action to make sure that German and Chinese and Japanese and Korean and Turkish and Spanish and Italian and Swedish firms can all work in your country, because if they don't, you're only going to get, the usual 4 actors or the usual 5 actors, and it's going to be an oligopoly and rip your budget. So this is so essentially the state is a coordinating body. This is also why municipalization was such a big thing 100 years ago, running things at the municipal level. Municipal school systems in the United States, municipal sewer systems, municipal public transport systems. And today, if you try to municipalize, nothing's going to work unless the municipality is the scale of something that's annexed most of its suburbs, like London or Berlin, or all of its suburbs, like Istanbul. Istanbul is a municipality of 16 million people. It might actually be the largest municipality, the most populous municipality in the world. And so, yeah, at that scale, yeah, you can municipalize, but we're talking about municipalities that are large enough that they're essentially regional planning, where you're not going to get American-style fractionalization of governance, where the way the incentives are such that where the way the incentives work is that each municipality snipes at the others. Oh, Shanghai is larger. Yes, you're right. Shanghai is like 25. Also, I wouldn't count Chongqing. Chongqing is weird. I mean, in theory, it's called a province-level city, but I believe that the majority of Chongqing's population is rural, so Chongqing is more like a single-tier government that is partly metropolitan, I think. But yeah, you're right about Shanghai, and also Beijing. I forget whether also Tianjin. But okay, so you can do municipal planning if you're this big, or even at a lower order of magnitude, Berlin. You can do municipal planning in Berlin. It will be imperfect. It'll be imperfect because we do have Potsdam, we do have Erkner, we do have Oranienburg, and that is gonna make things more complex. But most of the metropolitan area of Berlin is within city limits, and that makes BIFG level planning easier. But you absolutely can't do it without scale. You can't do it at the scale of Paris. RATP is a state agency. The Paris Police Prefecture is a state agency, which is not even just city police. It's city plus the Petite Couronne. So in France, they're recognized that they have this problem of scale. It's just that they have not a lot of local empowerment. So yeah, sure, RATP is run by the state. It doesn't matter whether it what the boundaries of Paris are when literally the person in charge of Paris is mostly a quality of life mayor. And so because you need this kind of scale, you need a very competent state to handle it, even if in the situation of, let's say, 1910, you didn't. Today it's different. Now, and this even cascades to poor countries, because in poor countries you would think, oh, you can privatize, because you can think, oh, okay, India today, and by today I mean before Corona, India in 2019, I believe the way that the most recent PPP system works is that it's believed that India in 2019 had the GDP per capita of the United States of 1899. And let's say, and then Kenya, for example, would be 1850s or 1860s or something like that. But you can't pretend India is like the America of the turn of the century, because it's different. Because the scale is different. The cities, for example, are a lot bigger. The urbanization rate might be lower, but the individual cities are bigger. It's fewer bigger cities, and there is an international market. And so, for example, if you're at the frontier of industrial competence in let's say in construction in America in the 1900s, yeah, you're building things in New York. But if you're at the frontier of industrial competence in construction in India today, you don't stay in India because you work with firms in richer countries. And so even in poorer countries, it's necessary to have a high capacity state for these things. And so it's important to avoid privatizing the state, especially because of this interaction between third world and first. Because if you privatize the state in, for example, India, which is being done with they talk about turnkey contracts in Sweden, Trafikverket, but um, but in India, the high speed train between Mumbai, Ahmedabad, and Surat is a turnkey Shinkansen. It's a disaster because the because I'm forgetting which JR is handling this, but they're treating India as if it's like Japan. So they're using the labor capital ratio of Japan. They're using trains with the dimensions of Japan rather than the larger ones for India. They will not make any of these adjustments because to them, India is a periphery. India also believes it's a periphery. So, oh, it's JR Central? Okay, yeah. Ugh. And so the uh, and so the outcome of this is that because they're not trying to like maybe go into their own history and see how they built things generations ago to make sure that they're using labor instead of capital whenever possible in the conditions of India today, they're building it wrong, and the result is that they have very high construction costs in India. And they have the high construction costs precisely when they privatize the state to first world corporations. Now, could they privatize them to Indian corporations? Yes, but the Indian corporations, the innovative ones, would try to imitate the developed world because the developed world exists. That is a big difference. And so, even in a place with the economic complexity of 100 or 150 years ago, you still need to do procurement as if it's today and not 150 years ago. And this is why you need to avoid privatizing the state. This is why you need to make sure that you have plenty of expertise in the public sector. It's why you need to make sure that the public sector is not just competent, is competent. The public sector is run by people who feel like if the chips are down, then the government is going to be on their side, rather than scourge them as do-nothing unelected bureaucrats or whatever phrases the Republicans in the United States like to use for any member of the public sector who has not been vetted by the Federalist Society. So, and so this is necessary, and you cannot privatize your way out of that. Like, there really is no alternative to the state. And this is something where I'm worried that Sweden is maybe not converging to British costs, because it isn't, but it might be but it looks like it's about to convert to German or French ones. And of course, the reason British costs became so high is, I'm fairly certain, that they made this conscious choice to privatize the state. And American ones are very high because they likewise made a conscious choice never to develop an apolitical state. It's been, this keeps lying, right? It's been an hour 58. I'm going to stop and very quickly take questions. And because it's been 3 weeks, I should remind everyone that there might be 2 minutes of awkward silence. That's a lag. That's just lag. Like, I think I tested the lag and it's like a minute, but it also takes people time to think and type the question. Like, if there aren't any questions, we can make this 2 hours even and then stop, but Again, I do want to give another minute or two in case people have more questions. I mean, I don't want this to take forever, but I mean, eventually, when the report about Sweden is out, I'm probably going to do a very long FAQ. So, do I want to have BIFIG or contract MTR? I don't know. The answer is that I don't know. I don't know exactly what the situation in Stockholm was before they did the contract for MTR. It's a good question. In Berlin, I would be very skeptical of any proposal to privatize operations from BIFIG. But BIFIG has also been done this kind of weird internal privatization, aka more contingent labor force for certain functions. The labor efficiency here seems very high, and this is a matter of public success. The schedules here are very flat. Now, the sort of researchers in Sweden who talk about benefit-cost ratios a lot talk about the importance of cutting off-peak service. They've convinced themselves that off-peak service has a poor benefit-cost ratio, and in Germany the standard is you run the same service. And this is incredibly efficient, actually, because the off-peak trains are less busy, but conversely, the off-peak trains have very low marginal costs. So it's something that actually BIFIG is very good at. So I would be skeptical about any coalition here that proposed to do some kind of privatization. Let's say that I can maybe think of a scenario in which Die Linke goes off the deep end, and instead of red or green, the city gets a traffic light, and FDP starts getting opinions. It would be, I think, as far as I can tell, it would be pretty bad to contract out BIFIG. It's something that can be like the big changes would be things that probably need to be done. Oh, if I'm a mid-sized US city, okay, which mid-sized US city? Because mid-sized US city can mean San Francisco or it can mean Pittsburgh. So mid-sized cities use their own. So in the United States, basically nobody ever contracts. It's all internal. Some of them do a good job. Some of them do a shitty job. Oh, anything but buses. Yeah, these are still public companies. Although honestly, like practically every American city has like some kind of bullshit light rail line. Yeah, I mean, in the United States, I would be skeptical of contracting as well. Like their problems are not like the United States has very deep problems with public transit, even in operations. But it's not something that like none of these is a problem that privatization would fix. So the unit cost of a bus is essentially the driver's wage. In a place like New York, the wages may be excessive, by which I mean not excessive relative to market. They are not, but the market wages are excessive. But I don't think this is something that a private contractor would be able to fix. And so on a fixed budget, this is how many service hours you can run. You can say, oh, okay, a private contractor would maybe have straighter bus routes that don't have the weird meanders that you see very often in American cities. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, a bunch of us picked a random American city and did a bus redesign by Twitter. This is not the redesign. This is an actual route in an actual city, which is called Sioux City. I keep thinking it's Sioux Falls. It's not Sioux Falls. It's Sioux City. This is a suburb. This is actually This is actually either a bi-state or I think maybe a tri-state area. It's Iowa, Nebraska, and I think maybe one of the routes goes into South Dakota. So they get the interagency part, the intergovernmental part stuff, right? But this is the root. Uh, this is something that can be straightened with the public sector. You don't need the private sector for this. I mean, maybe you need the expertise of a private consultant to tell you how to do it, but but I mean, Jarrett Walker is never going to run the bus. Christoph Spieler is never going to run the bus. Do we have data on what cities own their own companies and contract the operation? No, but in the United States, I can't tell if literally nobody or practically nobody contracts operations. To put things in perspective, Keolis operates in the United States, and the majority of their work is the Boston commuter trains. Like there are, and that's considered unusual. It's also considered a relatively positive development. But first of all, the alternative would be Amtrak. And yeah, if the alternative is Amtrak, then anything short of Alexander Lukashenko or Kadyrov or these kinds of people is going to be better. So that's the first thing, and the second thing is even then, the main innovations in Boston are at the level of the public sector. Keolis' expertise as a private contractor has not led to any kind of modernization. To the extent that it's building and doing any kind of modernization, it's with one of its own workers that's restored. But this is entirely something that's on the state legislature to fund, entirely on the MBTA to shepherd any kind of regional rail modernization, even with the contracting. So the contracting is not fixing the competence issue in the public sector. I'm not saying that they should yank it from Keolis again, especially if the alternative is Amtrak as it is today. But it's not I would not prescribe that for, let's say, the LIRR and Metro North. They have other problems, but the problem is that privatization is a public enterprise. Once you privatize, it's done by the private sector. So JR East, private company. Virgin Railways, or Virgin Rail, I'm forgetting the name, private company. Transdev, private company. But the boundary, that is to say, the process that turned the wildly unprofitable, debt-ridden JNR of 1980 into the JRs today, that was a public process. The shedding of the labor force, their placement in the private sector, the spinning off of certain, I think the spinning off of the rural lines to third sector railways was post-privatization, but the actual privatization was a public sector undertaking. And so the state needs to be capable of privatizing. And remember, Trafikverket recognizes this, which is why it's taking a few things in-house just to be able to benchmark. And so the important thing is that if your problem is not a worry that in the future wages would rise beyond productivity, but in the present wages are too high relative to productivity, or even worse, headcounts are too high, you can't just privatize your way out of it, because the same unions that can defeat any attempt to do layoffs can also defeat any attempt to privatize, knowing that the layoffs are coming. Incompetence knows that it's incompetent. Overstaffing knows that it's overstaffed. And so if New York just tries to waltz its way into contracting out the LIR and Metro North, the unions and the various local interests that are maybe not even pro-union but are pro-status quo are going to be able to write down a clause in the contract that will preserve current labor relations in amber and make reform harder rather than easier. This was even done with Keolis and the MBTA. Keolis knows how to do proof of payment because SNCF does it all the time at home, but they can't because the contract requires a certain number of conductors on the train. I believe it's a conductor per every 300 passengers or 2 cars. This is why they keep cars closed. If you've ever taken a commuter train in Boston off-peak, you might have noticed that there's an 8-car train, but only 2 cars are open, because they because the because if only 2 cars are open, they only need 1 conductor to do the doors, and that is true even if the doors are automatic, which aren't always. So so they're not optimally using the material that they have, always, because the contract forbids them to. And so if you're trying to, so you can't, so you can again, you can prevent wages from rising too much or staffing from rising too much in the future. But if they're too high in the present, you need to be able to, you need to have that labor relations expert. I shouldn't say expertise, not some kind of rarefied knowledge, the ability to restore, the ability to reduce staffing is something that you need, and it's not, and privatization won't save you on this. So this is the main issue that I have for, let's say, for these mid-sized U.S. cities. Again, for mid-sized U.S. cities that only have buses, it's not even that relevant. But for larger ones that also have trains, it absolutely is. If that makes sense. Do you have more questions or follow-up questions? I'm gonna give like 1 more minute, and then if nobody has more questions, then I can end this and do. I guess this is 2:10. It's not gonna be 2:10. It's gonna be 2:13ish. Yeah, that's the usual. As I keep saying, it's the usual awkwardness coming from the lag and from the fact that I don't video edit. Because if I video edited, I wouldn't be editing a 2-hour video. I would be making 5-minute videos. Like, I know how content creation is supposed to work. Anyway, so thank you all for coming back after a 3-week hiatus. I don't have a topic for next week, but I should be streaming again. And soon thereafter, there's going to be just transit costs project related content. So spread this far and wide. So thank you, and I will see you again soon.